When I first saw it, we were talking about authoritarian in Quatour, but the Quatour of authorization, and I for one am looking forward to learning about where we're going with that. So I'd like to invite Gerry, Gebel, and David Brossard from Mathematics to come on up on the side without the steps.
Of course.
And the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you, Alan.
You don't need my mic, right?
Nope. We do not, no. Thank you.
We do need the time, though.
Yeah, the timer would be great. So thanks, everyone, for joining. David and I do many presentations together, usually not in the same place in the same time, so maybe you stay over there.
I'll do that.
More like we normally do this.
Who's this on the call?
Yeah, we can do the GoToMeeting video. So Quatour, not Quatour or anything else like that. This is really a tribute to being in the French Quarter, being in New Orleans, the fact that you are French as well.
Indeed.
Right? Oui. So we'll explain a little bit more as we go along here what we're focusing on today. But why is Axiomatics here? Well, the authorization track, we specialize in authorization. This is all we do. So we're going to talk about some different components of authorization and access control from our perspectives and from our experiences. And David, there's a number of reasons why we need to talk about this.
Absolutely. So we've noticed over the years, and you've noticed over the years, that the amount of data, this is my clicker, by the way.
Yeah,
he's the human clicker.
Right.
There's more data than ever. There's more users, different types of users. It's not employees anymore. You saw a couple tracks on not handling your customers like you would your employees. There's more partners, more information, more services, more processes than ever before. And it becomes really noisy. It's more of everything. And when that happens, how do you handle authorization? I mean, do you do authorization in every single silo in a different way? I mean, how do you even process the question of who can get access to what particular resource? How do you formulate those questions? And that's what we're trying to solve today, bring a unified version to that messy noise.
Right, and here's where the quartet or the quarter comes in. We want to talk about 4 different technologies or infrastructure components or processes that deal with authorization or access control, but from different perspectives. I mean, we obviously focus on runtime authorization in the upper right. That's why it's in the upper right quadrant, of course. But
I didn't think about that one.
There's also administrative processes, access review and governance activities that happen, and then, of course, log analysis to see what did happen. These are not the only 4, obviously, different kinds of authorizations. You could think of authentication as an access control method, for example.
Of course, access control lists directly derived from authentication. If you authenticate, you're in. That's usually not enough, though.
Right. But in our case, we, due to time limitations, had to pick a few. So we're looking at these 4, again, mostly from our perspective as a runtime access control company, from our experiences and from our conversations with customers. Because if you don't coordinate these activities, what happens, David?
You get a lot of cacophony, a lot of discordant sounds, and it's noisy, it's not pleasant. It's like free jazz. I went to a jazz concert a few weeks ago in Chicago. I guess I was warming up to New Orleans. And I forgot to read the word free in the title, or maybe I thought it meant that I didn't have to pay any money. But it was free, very, very, very modern jazz. And to me, that was cacophony. It was too much, too weird, too strange. And today, because we have so many services, so many processes, so much data, it sounds like a cacophony. What we want to do is bind those 4 areas of authorization together to have a consistent, a clear picture of how to handle access control.
Right, because often there's a lot of improv going on right between them. And in organizations, you have different teams maybe managing those different functions or infrastructure components. And what we're trying to highlight here is more opportunities for a symphony or more orchestration between them.
Tying the processes together, finding the common policy to drive those authorization processes and configuration processes together.
Right. So the first one, David, we'll talk about it, happens at admin time.
Yep.
Right. This is the joiner, mover, leaver process that's very prevalent these days, dealing with moving attributes around, right, adding people to ACL lists, group lists. This is often where roles are managed as well. Roles are defined, and workflow, or some kind of approval workflow, is the typical policy model of choice here. And we'll also talk about policies a fair amount during the conversation, because that's an opportunity for some of that discordance between the components.
Right. And this is more the traditional approach that we've seen since the 90s. Not that I was around, but
of course.
Yeah.
Right, and this is really one of the starting points for the attribute data flow that happens, that a lot of downstream applications and systems will consume. You know, typically using HR or other sources as some of the anchor points. And so as we go through the discussion here, we'll raise some potential issues or challenges and hopefully some possible solutions. So here, as I mentioned a moment ago, you know, the workflow approval process is typically the policy model of choice. Obviously, this is different than, for example, what we use at runtime or what other applications might use at runtime. So there's potential that it's not configured properly, that you have a gap or you have redundancies. At least you have a redundant effort in defining the workflow approval in one system and then maybe runtime access controls in the application or in other components.
These processes are very identity-centric, group-centric. They can't cater to relationships between the users and the data, and that's the richness we're missing in this approach.
Right. So what's a possible solution here? Well, we've actually seen some customers use the runtime access policies to drive the provisioning process. It's kind of a little bit of an edge use case, but we've seen some other customers show interest in this model. So at least you're defining those access policies once in one language format, but you're able to use that both for administrative access control as well as runtime access control.
And you gain on the audit and the access review phase, and we'll see that later.
Absolutely. So David, what about that runtime environment?
So the runtime piece is what we call attribute-based access control. So show of hands, who has heard the term ABAC before? Okay, great.
Excellent.
ABAC is the solution to all your pains. That's what I believe. More seriously, it isn't. Combined with other techniques, combining runtime authorization with admin time and the other phases we'll see, it delivers a great model for authorization. And the way I like to see it is that you have a brain in the middle, not mine, and that brain decides. All it does is decide. It's configured through policy. You send it a request and it decides. You feed it contextual information. For instance, time of the day, location of the user, risk factors, IP, any bit of contextual data that you have, you can feed it to the brain. You feed it as well other attributes of the user, their citizenship, their current location, their age, their shoe size if you want it to. You can also feed it, of course, the policies. The policies are what matters at the end of the day in authorization. The policies will determine what is allowed and also what is not allowed. That's the difference, by the way, Gerry, with admin time, because at runtime we can define negative policies, and typically in the admin phase you only define what's possible, not what's impossible.
Right, and I think you define more of the static variables at the admin time, but at runtime you can take into account all these current dynamic variables, right?
Correct, and the policies can express relationships, which means that you can express segregation of duty. Things like, as a whole, you have the right to approve transactions, but you cannot approve your own segregation of duty. So the last thing, of course, that goes into the brain is the question. Can Alice view record 123 is your typical 101 question. Can Bob approve process 37? Yes, he can if he did not create it. And then on the right-hand side, next to the brain, we have the enforcer, the muscle, not the brain, the muscle, the arm, the hand. That part is responsible for enforcing whatever the brain says. So you have this separation, this decoupling between the decision-making that happens centrally, and that's important because you want it to have externalized from your enforcement process.
And I think Eve mentioned some of that decoupling in her session previous to ours, right?
Yes, she did indeed.
It's a similar model in that regard.
Yeah. And when Eve was mentioning policies, she didn't mention the language that you could use, but you could actually use ABAC to do those policies. They tie in really well together. And what ABAC does for you when your authorization is that it centralizes your authorization management. Now, instead of having bits and pieces of authorization in your many different apps, you have it in one central location expressed in a single language. It's externalized as well, meaning that it doesn't really matter what app you're dealing with. If it's homegrown, Java, .NET, Ruby, Microsoft, whatever, it doesn't matter. You'll always have the enforcement piece that will adapt to the application you want to protect. We're seeing a lot of microservices these days. That's a great fit for
Very popular,
ABAC.
yeah.
Yep. It's attribute-driven. That's why it's called ABAC. That's a given. And again, attributes are just key value pairs. They can be anything that describes users, resources, actions, and contextual information. They're policy driven. I think we've mentioned that before.
Yes, we have.
Yep. And finally, a side benefit is that they're standards based. Eve mentioned a couple of the standards she's involved in, UMA and the other ones. We're involved in a standard called XACML or XACML. It's also an OASIS standard. It collaborates extremely well with other standards like SAML, like OpenID Connect, like UMA. That's not it, Gerry, right? We've got issues with that model.
There's always challenges.
There's always challenges.
Especially in the legacy world.
Yes. This technology, runtime authorization, works best with new developments, with API-driven architectures. When you're dealing with legacy applications, say SAP, or I hope no one works with SAP here, right? I didn't offend anyone. Or you're working with the mainframe, it can be harder to apply runtime authorization to those applications. Also, if you start introducing attributes into the equation, you need to be able to govern those attributes, know who can change the values and when. And finally, you need to be able to coordinate your policies, the admin time policies that you mentioned, but also the runtime policies that you can use in this phase. Make sure that they're consistent.
Right, for example, you mentioned separation of duties. So certainly you have those kind of rules in workflow approval processing, but then as you mentioned, we can also have them in the runtime. So you need to be able to coordinate them and make sure they're equal, right? Right,
yeah. But we do have solutions. I mean, the best way, the simplest way is to aim for the sweet spot integration spot, meaning you look at your APIs, which is great because microservices are actually giving us those, or API gateways are giving us those, or products like Ping Access are giving us the ability to easily extend what they do and provide the runtime authorization. Also, IAG vendors help us process the policies that we generate to make sense of them and produce governance reports that then the administrators can look at. And finally, I mean, you have to look at, I think Eve mentioned that really well, you got to look at the different standards that exist and how they collaborate to provide best practices in the different areas where authorization overlaps with user-managed access or with governance.
And I think one thing to look for here is maybe some developments or evolutions over time where I think we're looking to work with some vendors in other of these categories to define some best practices and publish them. And maybe over time there can be some standard-based profiles for automating some of the exchanges between these kind of different product technologies.
Yes. Bridge the gap.
So what's up next? So next.
Over to you.
All right. Another thing that we called out earlier is the access review or the access certification process, right? Because now we've established the admin time workflows. We're starting this joiner mover leaver process and changing data. We have these runtime systems that are trying to do policy enforcement, but we still need to make sure that all of these systems are configured properly. And this is part of the access review or certification process that people go through on a regular basis, some more frequent than others depending on the industry that we're in. So we might want to make sure the role assignments are right, things like that, make sure that you know, my friend, the administrator, gave me access to this database, but that wasn't part of the workflow approval. Should that be rejected? Should it be reincorporated? So it's these kinds of things that we're trying to do in the access review process. But also, in some cases, to look forward, what could happen, right? And this is often what auditors will ask. Okay, I see you have these roles. What can people with this combination of role assignments do in this application? So we're trying to test also for those kinds of circumstances.
And also trying to make the authorization configuration more human understandable. Typically, or very often, you'll end up with roles and permission sets that are very complicated or complex, where the name is system1 _ manager _ California _ 3 p.m. How do you understand what that means? It's nonsensical. Right. So if in the access review phase you can actually try to elevate those roles and those permissions so that they make sense, then it's a big win for everyone.
Yeah, it's very beneficial. So some of the possible issues here, right, that our workflow rules were not configured correctly at first, or their requirements are changing over time. Again, checking for those out-of-band privileges that may have been added manually. Maybe our requirements for the application security have changed since we originally created the workflow rules. So this is where the IAG, the Identity and Access Governance tools, really help out really well. This is what they're built for, both many of them, both on the provisioning side as well as the access review side. And we've also introduced a product here to help analyze and report on the specific ABAC policy so we can further supplement that access review process. But David, there's also everything that did happen. So
Correct.
we just looked at what could happen and the way a system is configured, but now we've got a lot of log data to look at as well, right?
Yeah, and that ties in nicely with the keynote we had after lunch today, where they were talking about business intelligence and analyzing all the information, all the signals you're getting. When you're doing authorization, you have the ability to collect the logs from those authorization systems. So these could be the provisioning systems that you have where you provision your roles, or the systems you use to manage your roles and your permissions, to the runtime piece that will generate logs as access is requested, to the admin logs of whoever changed which permission or which policy.
Plus application logs, network logs,
Plus,
right? So there's so much
absolutely.
data
Yeah.
out there being generated.
Yeah. So you want to collect all those logs, right? And each and every log on their own, they're a bit of like a single voice, a solo, if you will. And on their own, they tell one single story, which can be interesting. But what you really, really want to do is bring all those logs together and analyze them together to really understand what did happen. So if your central authorization service says that, yes, Bob did get access to this particular resource, that's what you think. But you got to check with the app to make sure that, yep, indeed, the person did get access to the app. The fact that the authorization engine said yes, it doesn't mean that the user actually did do it. You would expect it to be the case, but not always. So you want to bring all those logs together and create a nice chorus, if you will, a nice choir almost of different signals being brought together, analyzed together for better log analysis, for even potentially reactive systems. If you start seeing that a user is logging in again and again and again and failing to log in, then maybe you need to remove the user from your systems. If you see that, generally speaking, you have 90% permits in your system and suddenly you jump to 90% denies, then you know that either there's a misconfiguration or you're under attack. So you can react to those signals, and you can be more risk aware, and handle your risk a bit better.
I think Patrick Harding mentioned that as well this morning in his keynote,
Yes,
right?
indeed, yep.
I think he called it identity intelligence data, right? Being able to be more proactive and use this kind of risk analytics at runtime rather than just, say, for forensic investigations and such.
So back in a prior life, I used to do research, and one of the things we looked into was something we call ECA, or ECA, event condition action. An event occurs, there's a condition on the event, and then you do an action. So that's one way of doing log analysis, and it's a really cool thing for the future.
All right. So what about issues, possible
Well, logs can get
here?
really, really big, really verbose, so you have to be able to store all that information. That's one of the issues. They can contain sensitive information as well. When I talk to customers, we have the two extremes. We have customers who want everything in the logs, and they're really nervous if we don't produce the right authorization logs. And we have customers who don't want anything in the logs because it could contain PII or SSN or credit card number or whatever. So you got to know what risk or what information you're putting in the logs, and you got to be comfortable with that information. And you've got to know who's getting access to those logs as well, so that you're not leaking any information that way. Also, you want to be able to correlate the logs. So if you have application logs, you need to be able to correlate them back to the authorization logs you had before to make sure that they belong to the same transaction, for instance. But fortunately, these are relatively easy issues. Well, relatively easy. I'm not the one solving them. They're relatively easy issues to solve. I mean, especially now with the ability of big data to process vast amounts of information. Also, the cost of storage is peanuts these days. I hope no one's got a peanut allergy in the room. No? Oh, we got one there. Sorry. So I think that if you use these technologies, you'll be able to process those logs and get the information that you're interested in for better reactive authorization.
Yeah, we hear of people using some of the off-the-shelf BI tools for that, coming up with their own analytics. There's a lot of data science research going on out there, so it's a really interesting area. But again, if we can harvest this information also to use at runtime, not just after the fact analysis, that would be great.
Correct.
Right?
So we could even define policies that say the user can access this given resource if they haven't had a deny in the last 3 hours. If they've had a deny, then why should they try again? You know,
right.
Cool scenarios.
Okay. So David, let's I think wrap it up from here, right?
Yep.
So we've given just a brief tour of 4 different authorization or access control kind of technologies that today probably typically operate in an ad hoc or independent manner, one from the other. And so we're saying there should be a call to action to try to coordinate these different technologies a little bit better than we do today. In some ways, there could be best practices published, or maybe even standard-based profiles to help the exchange of particularly policy information, but also other data between these different components.
Correct. And this is really what we like to call the policy-driven enterprise. If you can manage to define everything in terms of policies, human-readable policies that actually match the original requirements, that's the way you want to go. Historically, we've been very good in IT at doing IT stuff, IT configuration, and then you kind of lose the original requirements. And then, of course, it means that you got to go into every single place and turn those knobs, and it becomes very cumbersome. So if you can try to drive for the policy-driven enterprise in everything, not just security, not just authorization, but also in IT resource provisioning, this is a great way to move forward and make the enterprise more scalable and more secure.
All right, excellent. So that ends our prepared comments. And so, Alan, we'll turn it back over to you to moderate Q&A. Isn't that part of your job today?
Sure. Okay, I'll do that. You want to speak to the mic? Go for it.
I was interested in the last part where you were talking about the log harvesting, and I was just wondering if there's potentially a way that you'd be able to, instead of harvesting it, then to go out and analyze it in place, as opposed to putting it into a big data.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you can, absolutely. It depends on your log analysis tools that you have. Some of our customers use products like Splunk. With Splunk, you've got the two models. You can actually push the logs to that central location, or you can just go out and in the same place analyze the information. One thing we've noticed is that logs can be, we said it in the presentation, it can be really, really verbose. So what you want to do is first shrink them, or at least get rid of the information that you're not interested in, and then get the right signals out of those logs. And yeah, you can do that locally.
Well, David, you can also use analytics data from individual sources, like an adaptive authentication system. So they're just scoring the authentication process and that establishment of that session, and that could have a risk score associated with it. So we can just grab that information and not necessarily wait for it to be correlated with everything else. Any other questions, comments? No? All right, well, thank you for your attention, and come visit us on the exhibit floor if you have additional questions. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Gerry.